Have you checked the children? Your little master.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers, along the path of the beam. I am known on this level of the tower as Jaime and Fuego, and if it please you, join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail Yeah to Stephen King. It's easy, and obviously, as always, bienvenidos. Welcome to the horror show, and this is a program that I do every terrifying Tower Tuesday, and yes, over 300 episodes strong here. So if you were just stumbling upon the proceedings here, Sai King is my favorite author. I have read every single bit of published work that he has available, and I have seen all of the film adaptations as well, and that is what we will be talking about today for its 35th anniversary, which is being celebrated this May, and that is none other than Creepshow 2! Yes, Creepshow 2. And so, the original Creepshow from the earlier 80s, a few years before, was heavily celebrated, and George Romero directed, from a script by Sai King, I believe, or maybe they collaborated on that, I can't remember specifics of that, but yes, it was 5 tales in that particular version, and it was critically well received, made some money at the box office, and so obviously, they're like, we need to do another homage to those EC comics that we love so goddamn much, and that him and Romero bonded over, and just struck up a friendship as two very just unique and popular icons of horror in the 70s and the 80s. And so, get Creepshow 2, but unfortunately it was kind of a more watered down version in my estimation, and more so than anything because of the fact that due to budgetary constraints they only ended up doing 3 stories as opposed to the originally intended 5. And so the 2 that were omitted, I've actually covered them both in separate videos here before, and I will make sure to actually link those in the end credits stuff. But so there was a tale called Pinfall, and that was one that I did a specific video about because of the fact that in this amazing Arrow version of Creepshow 2 that was released a few years ago, they actually turned it into a comic book. So I'm not going to go into any supreme specifics about that here because I did a full video strictly about Pinfall, and it's about these rivaling bowling teams and how things get a little murderous when this very rich, well-to-do person puts some prize money out there. So I'm glad that it can at least be seen. So it's like a long-lost king tale that is tough to track down, and believe me, it's a difficult process trying to get this because it was only in the European Region 2 version of Creepshow 2, which sucks, in my estimation, although now that I think about it offhand, I think one of my viewers here on Hail to Stephen King had told me that it was just a limited edition version when Arrow first put it out, so maybe it was available in Region 1 here in North America, here in the deadly desert of Arizona, where we broadcast for the horror show from. But yeah, anyway, Pinfall is interesting, and if you want to check out a whole video about that particular story, get to it. But the other story of the 5 that had to be condensed down to 3 due to its omission was The Cat from Hell, and that was a short story I think King eventually ended up including in the Just After Sunset collection, but it was eventually adapted into what Tom Savini, who stars as the creep in this actually, our storyteller of sorts. He doesn't do the voice, unfortunately, but when you see him in the live action form delivering the papers and stuff like that, that is Tom Savini under a lot of makeup. But Savini has gone on record many times to say that Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, is the unofficial Creepshow 3, because there is a Creepshow 3, and I have most definitely covered that here on the channel. It's from a series that I did on Hail to Stephen King entitled Films That Forgot the Face of Their Father. And that's not to say you can't find some drunken or enhanced amusement from Creepshow 3, but man, Creepshow 3 is fucking ballsack. It is so bad. And so, yeah, in any event, Tales from the Dark Side eventually adapted The Cat from Hell, and it's not one of my personal favorites. It gets gruesome with the cat climbing out of, somebody's mouth at one particular point, but nonetheless, those were the 2 stories that were cut out for the 3 that we eventually ended up getting for the film that was released May 1st, 1987 by New World Pictures, if I remember correctly. And unlike the first one, like I said, this one was not particularly well received, most notably from critics. It was slogged by the predominance of them, who said the stories are too long, it was just, gore without imagination, and blah, blah, blah. It only has a 29% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I guess that is fairly indicative of, how the reception went down, at least from the critical side of things. However, I have always found a certain affinity for this film because of the fact that it features actually my favorite segment in all of the Creepshow stories, and that also includes the recent revival that they had on, I think it's Shudder / AMC Plus, and I know it's streaming on a couple different spots, but yes, it is a Shudder original, and it has been curated by Greg Nicotero. He's the showrunner. I think they have 3 seasons under their belt now, plus a couple animated specials and holiday specials, and so the Creepshow brand is very much still alive and well, but the segment, the Raft, in this that we'll get to here in a little bit, is my personal favorite segment of anything Creepshow related. It's so damn good, and yes, but first and foremost, let's just talk about the fact that when the film initially starts, and ironically enough directed by Michael Garnick, only feature he ever directed, but he was a longtime cinematographer, the DP for George Romero, and so he was the DP on Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, the Night Riders, which also had a King cameo in it, which is pretty funny, and so yeah, they had that connectivity, and so for whatever reason, George did not want to return to direct this one. He still wrote the screenplay, but yeah, he hands it off to his longtime cinematographer to direct it, and I will definitely say it doesn't quite have that same visual flair. In the first segment, which we're about to talk about here, the old Chief Woodenhead, you get a little bit of that with some of the lighting during a robbery scene, but it really just doesn't have that pop and that pizzazz with the greens and the reds and stuff that were utilized so well and made the original Creepshow feel more like a comic book in a lot of ways. A comic book, come to life on screen, And there's very few, I think, that have done that aside from Sin City, that's one of the first that comes to mind where it definitely feels like I'm watching a comic book, and Watchmen, yeah, to a degree as well, the Zack Snyder adaptation, but so yeah, it doesn't have quite the same pop in the flair, but nonetheless, we do have a overarching a preface and then some interludes of a story of this kid who is waiting on the newest issue of Creepshow, which is actually the cover that they show at the end of the first movie, which is kind of cool. And so he gets it and he sends away for these giant Venus flytraps, and it's to combat some bullies. And interestingly enough, for those particular interludes, it starts out in live action and then it segues into kind of a choppy, slightly crappy looking animation from the 80s, much more akin to, some of the things like the animated version of The Hobbit, or even maybe Last Unicorn. It definitely does not look like Disney animation. It has its own distinctiveness, but it's not very fluid. It's more on the choppy side of things, and I would imagine budgetary constraints also had something to do with that. But there is kind of a schlocky charm to it, which maybe, even if it wasn't intentional, it still adds a little bit of interestingness to, compared to the original Creepshow. So that's done a little bit differently, but I also think maybe that, they weren't going to be able to show bullies getting eaten by Venus flytraps, which we get at the end of this. And so, yes, this is a spoilery review. Obviously, guys, the film is 35 years old, so... And streams on Tubi for free, which is cool. You have to deal with the ads, but hey, it is what it is. So that is our wraparound, as they like to call it, and we do get, the Creep introduces each of the stories in animated form, like he's feeding like a big giant lizard at one particular point. He's in the forest at another point when our lead kid, I think his name is Billy, is getting chased by these bullies and stuff. And so, yeah, that's our wraparound, and it's fine, it's moderately entertaining. It's not bad by any means, but, and then the payoff is good with what we finally get. But just the variety of bullies, there's this metal punk kid, this big heavier set dude, but then as we all too often get in so many different King adaptations, we just got in Firestarter 2022, there's a ginger bully, and so I guess Cartman from South Park was right about the soullessness of gingers and whatnot. And just to clarify, I am a daywalker, everybody, by the way. So, but yeah, so we get into our first story proper and segue from the animation into the live action, as we have for all 3 of the tales proper. And yeah, old Chief Woodenhead. And so the Arizona connection is very real in this because of the fact that 2 of our segments are actually filmed in my homestay here in the Deadly Desert. And so this one was filmed in Dewey Humboldt, which is, it's a few hours north of me here in the Valley of the Spun, as I all too often say. And yeah, it's up in Yavapai County, which is where there's Prescott and Flagstaff and stuff like that, where a lot of people don't often realize that, yeah, it's not just desert in Arizona. You go up north and you've got forests and so on and so forth, but this is like more of a deserted, deserty town because you still get those in areas even when you head up north a few hours. And yeah, so there is this proprietor of like a general store, so to speak, and it's in this dying town, and there's a Indian reservation sort of vibe going on, whether they're on one or just bordering one, but it's called Dead River, Arizona, not a real place. But so George Kennedy, of all people, who is the proprietor of this store that has this, old Chief Woodenhead, who is this like statuesque, old Navajo who is out in front of the establishment. He's like a wood carving kind of thing. And yeah, George Kennedy, so many things, hundreds and hundreds of roles, both on television and in film. I mean, I probably think of him more so than anything from the Naked Gun movies, but he did so much, man. Cool Hand Luke, all those airport movies, had tons of TV work. So McHale's Navy, I know he's on a few episodes of that. So he's one of those guys that was able to straddle the line between serious and comedic, and so props to that. And he's probably the biggest aspect of star power that we have in this particular film. And so, excuse me, but yeah, so he is... he's indebted by these particular Navajos, and one in particular with the last name Whiteman, Benjamin Whiteman. And so he goes and he's like, we can't pay our debts off now, but here's a bunch of valuables that we have, and if we can't pay you back in 2 autumns, they're yours to keep. And so it's like $10,000 worth of like, silver, precious stones, stuff like that. And so after that exchange goes down for said debt, the character played by George Kennedy, his wife is like, we need to just sell this place, pack up and go, enjoy, our twilight years, enjoy retirement. And yet, our lead character is like, nope, I feel a debt, and I feel like a dedication to this town because it's great land and it's going to come back. And so he's just like positive about that. And so in any event, then there's a robbery that goes down because Benjamin's nephew, Sam, who is the character everybody remembers this story for, because he's got, I don't know if it's a wig or not, but in any event, he's got this long, luscious, Native American hair, as I all too often do, believe me. A lot of my Native friends, used to go to Bylas, Arizona all the time to play basketball when I was growing up, and my grade school had a direct affiliation with a couple different churches that were also on the reservation. And so, yeah, I went to school with a lot of Native kids, and they were all super cool, and we bonded over everything from horror to gangster rap at the time and all that fun stuff. And, a lot of my best friends in grade school, were Native. And so this kid is a trip, though, man, because he is intent on the fact that he's going to go to Hollywood, he's going to be a star, and the line everybody remembers, this hair is going to get me paid and laid. And you're just like, good Lord, bro, shut the fuck up. But it's a robbery that ends up turning into murder, and it kind of happens unintentionally at first, but then Sam just rolls with it, and after accidentally shooting the wife, then he's just like, well, to hell with it, I don't want any witnesses, and so he kills George Kennedy's character too. And he's got these 2 sidekicks that they're as one-dimensional as you would think. There's like the hesitant rich kid who's got the getaway car, and then there's Fatso, who is just stuffing his face the entire robbery. So, yeah, very, very one-note psyching, not anything particularly interesting from either of them, and they're just like gleefully laughing it up and whatnot. So Sam Whitemoon is the most interesting, obviously being the ringleader. He's probably got the most personality and is the most well-rounded of all of them. But yeah, as you may have expected, there has to be a supernatural turn of some point in this, being Stephen King, and that's where, Chief Woodenhead rises and goes to avenge the death of them. The shotgun blasts were surprisingly tame, I gotta say. And, then you get some arrows through Fatso, which are, decent practical gore by Savini, but nothing too outrageous. And then there's a hatchet death that you see off screen. It's like in the shadows, and then you just see the aftermath. So once again, I would imagine budgetary constraints just to see the dead body smashed on the car after the fact, as opposed to actually being able to show the gore of the hatchets. But then again, with the second and the third segment, where they save their money for the gore. So, although there is a scalping that, once again, you see it start to happen, and then there's a cutaway, and then you just see the scalp and, Sam's long hair in the hands of, Chief Woodenhead. And so, all in all, this is a story that I've always found to be, a little goofy, but it's not the worst of the three. The worst of the three is still to come, but it's never been like one of my favorites on all of the, you know, echelon of Creepshow stories that have been told between the television series and, you know, the films at this particular point. So it's okay. I was a little bit more appreciative of it, I think, with this viewing than I had been in previous years, because I used to really just shit on this story and be like, it's so dumb, it's so lame. I don't know. It's got that right amount of like just, you know, I don't know, cheese and camp and whatever to it. But there is an interesting connection, though, because there's characters in this that are watching a old movie where there's loco, loco, and the two characters calling each other Cisco and Pancho, and that ties right in with our second story, which is the greatest segment ever in anything Creepshow that has been done, and that is the Raft. And the Raft is the only one of these three stories that had been actually previously published in print, like as a short story, and the Raft was originally in the November 1982 issue of Gallery. And Gallery, from what I found out in my research, is another one of those nudie mags, to quote Al Bundy, that King published a lot of his stuff in those earlier years in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that, and not just of the Playboy variety, you know. So yeah, Gallery. I don't know if it's still published or anything, because so many things have gone just purely digital, and with, you know, the accessibility of porn, both hard and softcore at this point, I would imagine more people probably buy Playboy, if it is even still published, or any of these other magazines, for the articles. But yeah, it was later collected in Skeleton Crew, June 21st, 1985. And so the short story is, I've talked about it a lot on this before, so I'm not going to like do a lot of compare and contrast because of the fact that the short story is terrific. I think it's one of the most faithful adaptations, and this one, the Arizona connection continues. This one was filmed in Prescott, Arizona, at a lake that I've actually been to, Granite Basin Lake. Prescott is about an hour and a half north of the Phoenix metropolitan area, which is where myself and Cecil and the rest of the gang reside. And so, yeah, it's a pretty lake, and, you know, nice forestry around it, but with just that little hint of, I guess, you know, just rustic desertness, despite the green foliage and stuff. And so, yeah, you've got these four friends, Rachel, Deke, Randy, and Laverne. And so, yeah, they're a bunch of college kids, and they're just getting stoned and having some drinks, and they're driving to this lake right before Halloween. And yet, even in Arizona, man, I know the original story, I think, takes place in Pennsylvania, but even in Arizona, if you're up north where it's like 20 to 30 degrees cooler a lot of the time, most of the year, yeah, that water is going to be freaking cold in October. And so they have this like raft. So it's like this like huge wooden like floating plank, like collection of planks out in the middle of this lake. And you know, Randy's character is like, yeah, you know, I saw that it was there, even though there's like a little bit of doubt from, you know, his other three friends. And so they get there, they leave the car running, the Camaro's out there, and they're blasting some, you know, rock jams that I'm sure King would properly approve of. And so they swim out, and they're on this raft, and they're hanging, they light up another joint. But as they were making their way over, swimming, they see the tar slick, as they call it, or oil slick, or whatever. And yes, I will admit that 35 years later, it's just a floating tarp, and it is nowhere near as amazingly described as King mentions it, and it can't move as quickly as King mentions in the source material of the short story. And there's only a couple instances where you see like kind of the colorful glimmerness of the top of it, because that plays very heavily into the short. And there's really only one situation, and I believe it's with Rachel, yeah, because she's the first to bite the dust to this thing and get chomped on and eaten and dissolved into this thing. But her instance of death is really the only one where you get that little hint of what was made abundantly clear in the source material, which is where the changing of the colors at the top of this oil slick creaturous, you know, blob is the best way to describe it. You know, it almost had like a hallucinogenic and like hypnotic sort of essence to it. And Rachel is just, she's staring at it, and for whatever reason she decides to go and try to touch it, and it pulls her in. And every single instance that I watch this short story adaptation, I remember seeing it in grade school at an older friend's house. I think I was like maybe 4th, 5th grade, something like that. And it was at one of the older kids' houses, and their parents were still off at work, and so we go back after school, and I caught this segment in particular, and it horrified me. It fucked me up, man. Nightmare status, dude. And this is like I love this story so much because it's gruesome, but it's also kind of goofy, you know, the interplay between Cisco and Pancho and the football player dude. I forget the name of that actor, and of all of my notes here that I'm going off of, I know I've seen him in a ton of stuff, and he is hella young in this, and he's funny, and the interplay between him and Randy, you know, the character of Deke, and what happens to Deke, it's even more gruesome. It's like with each of the deaths in this up until the fourth and final one, Savini and his gore team just kept upping the ante, because Deke, it's almost like note for note, just like in the book, and the fact that, you know, after Rachel gets eaten, the thing goes under the raft, and then it pulls Deke down through the cracks. It gets just enough of its oil slicky blobness up through those little indentations between each of the wooden planks of this raft, and pulls him down, and like his leg is like up in the air and shit, and it's so nasty. And even when you see it like just eating away at his you know, his like foot and ankle area and stuff before it pulls him down, gruesome. And then we get into the strange, silly territory, because in the short story, I do believe Randy and Laverne, despite the fact that Laverne was seemingly Deke's girl, well, hey, college days, man, or whatever, you know, swapping partners, passing, you know, pass the joint, pass the girl, whatever sort ofness. And in the short story, I believe they have sex, but in this one, Randy is made into, like, perv mode, dude, because Laverne is asleep, and they were supposedly, you know, trying to take turns watching the oil slick, and, you know, they're like, okay, I'll stay awake, and then you can sleep, and, you know, you stay awake, and I'll sleep, and vice versa, basically passing the proverbial baton. And he goes into pervo mode, like I said, man, and he's like, he lifts up her shirt, and great boobs, as you see in a lot of 80s horror movies, you know, but he's taking gross advantage of her, and it karmically puts him, because he is presented throughout the story as being this, you know, the virtuous one, and, you know, kinder, and, you know, whatever, compared to Deke. And then he's like taking advantage of this girl when she's asleep, and then in the most gruesome of the deaths, perhaps, she is awakened by the oil slick going at her and just tearing her face up. And that was also pure nightmare fodder. All three of the deaths are nightmare fodder. And Randy's like, to hell with this, man. And so he dives and he swims to shore. And this is where the ending changes compared to the short story. But it's hilarious, because he's like, I beat you! Because he gets to shore, and yet the oil slick is like, whap! And jumps on him and then pulls him out into the lake and consumes him and everything. And you hear it burp. It's funny. It just goes into that sort of cheesiness. And so, yeah, but Rachel's death might have been the most disturbing, the first one, because, you know, she's like, it hurts, as she's being dissolved by this thing. It's really, really messed up stuff, man, you know? And then there's another interlude as we have in between all the stories, and, you know, back to the bullies and, you know, Billy and whatever. But, you know, it's just very, very brief in that regard. And so then we get to the final story, and it's the worst story. And this is the one that I think, if any of those reviewers were talking about, it's, you know, it's too long, it's blah, 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 whatever, it is definitely The Hitchhiker, because of the fact that this story is about as one note as they come. It's a woman who's cheating on her husband, and she's driving home, and she's running late, and she's like preoccupied and whatever, and she runs over a hitchhiker, flees the scene of the accident, and you get this really funny Stephen King cameo as this truck driver, and of course he's just some dumbass who's like, looks like a black guy, huh? And you're just like, I don't know if he was trying to be funny, or if he just wrote the character to, whatever. It's like, color of dude's skin really had nothing to do with the fact that he got run over. It's just stupidness. But in any event, this one it's just, there's not much to it besides the fact that this hitchhiker keeps just supernaturally reappearing, and she just seemingly tries to kill it over and over and over. She runs him over again, she shoots him, she smashes him into a tree, and it's just the same beat over and over and over. You know, there is some cheesy charm to, like, the gleefulness of the gore as dude's corpse just becomes more and more decomposed and just messed up after her attempt after attempt to just finally be rid of him. But I mean, thanks for the ride, lady. You know, it's so one note. It's so boring. It's uninspired storytelling. You know, it really, the only selling point is just the amount of money that they spend on the gore as he continues just getting worse and worse with each reoccurring instance. But yeah, I mean, the lead actress, whose name I did not write down because of the fact that I really am just not about this segment at all, but she does have to, you know, shoulder a significant load because of the fact that you know, she's talking to herself and just working it out in her mind a lot of the time. There is some funny exchange of, you know, just like dialogue at the very beginning when she's leaving Sed's house, because she's not having an affair, so to speak. She's got this like hunky gigolo that she goes to, and she's spending her lawyer husband's money on, you know, her 6 orgasms for $125, and dude is like, maybe I should charge by the orgasm and blah blah. So that's funny enough, I suppose. And you do get a cool little Easter egg of Stephen King's It, the hardcover, is on the shelf behind Gigolo's bed, and that had just been released like a year or so before. That's kind of cool. But aside from that, this story pretty much sucks in my opinion. So, I mean, if you're just a gorehound and you can be satisfied with a story just based on that, I mean, sure, why not? But it is easily the weakest of the 3 segments here. So you've got the Raft like way up here, man. I mean, even higher than my camera right now. And then you've got old Chief Woodenhead, you know, and then, you know, way down, like down here, actually below, is yeah, the Hitchhiker. And I think this is actually the weakest of all of the segments from the original 2 Creepshow movies that Sai King and George Romero at least had involvement with. So there you have it, everybody. I cannot recommend this particular edition from Arrow enough. I know that a few years before there was a special edition DVD, and that was the previous version that I owned, and I think they brought over, I think, most of the bonus materials, but I mean, there is so much on this. I mean, it's a new 2K restoration. In this version, as I said, you've got the pinfall comic, which is pretty rad, but there is so much cool behind the scenes stuff. There's audio commentaries, there's new interviews with you know, actor Tom Wright. Screenplay for a sequel is an interview with George Romero. Tales from the Creep, an interview with Savini. So there's so much supplemental stuff, and as a collector of physical media, that's one of the reasons why I still buy this deluxe stuff from people like Arrow or Scream Factory or whatever, because I don't want to just own a digital copy of a movie. That's just me, you know? I know there's a lot of people who disagree and think differently, but, you know, nonetheless, this is a kick-ass collected edition of all kinds of great additional stuff, and cannot recommend it enough. So what do you guys think about Creepshow 2? Do you think I'm a little bit too hard on the 1st and the 3rd segment? Is the Raft as great as I'm proclaiming it to be? Let me know in the comments below, and I extend a grande gracias. I've been Jaime Fuego. You can find more on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on YouTube, and obviously, you know, the support of liking and sharing and subscribing and all that stuff is greatly appreciated. Don't forget that there is a Hail to Stephen King Facebook group where we talk Sai King every single day, and on Fridays we get a little looser, Free Guy Friday, and you get to talk about some different stuff besides King and his connected family, because we do talk Joe and Owen, you know, a little bit from time to time. Probably Joe Hill more so than anything else. Getting very excited for the Black Phone adaptation. And recent videos, we just did Cecil Laird, the founder of The Feast here, the showrunner, and myself, we did a review of the 2022 Firestarter, starring Zac Efron and that kick-ass little lady, Ryan, I forget the rest of her name, but she was on the most recent season of American Horror Story. So check that out. I'm going to link that in the description as well. And yeah, guys, until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, I say hasta luego, sen amigos, constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you. I'm hopeful that we share more of this palaver sooner rather than later. Don't forget that the book of the month that will be discussed at the beginning of June is The Running Man from Richard Bachman, the alias of Sai King. And yes, I hope that we have been well met today. We share more of this palaver sooner rather than later. And until then, remember to stay scared and read Stephen King. And yes, the only one that you can read from this collection is The Raft and Skeleton Crew, and it is most definitely worth your time.